Hi everyone, my name is Nancy Sifford Alana and I am an author. We are in the middle of my very first book, and that book is The Lost Treasure of Lincoln County. We are already on chapter 11, and chapter 11 is a pretty exciting chapter. Now, chapter 10 was too. Do you remember what happened in chapter 10? In chapter 10, it started raining when the boys were following the map. And so there was an old stable out in the middle of this pasture that was fairly close to where they were digging. So what they do, they took off running for the stable. And when they got in the stable, it was dark. It was dusty, it was dirty, it was dark. It was like an old stable. And so the boys got in there, and of course Dale wasn't real happy about having to be in there with all probably the spiders and everything else that was in there. And so he was hoping that the rain would stop pretty soon. And that way they could get out of there and get back to digging. Well, Dale tripped over something on the floor. And when he got to the ground, he realized that it was a round circle. It was like when you cut a log in half, but not in half necessarily, but you cut it and you can count the rings in the log. Well, it was like that. So he found that. And he was trying to figure out why that was there in the middle of the floor. Well, they started looking, and there were two other ones. Well, that was the triangle maybe that they were looking for. So they decided as soon as it stopped raining, Mr. Sifford would go get the little shovels, and they would start digging. So they did. Well, he uncovered what? Do you remember what he uncovered? He uncovered this door that had been put on the ground and covered up with dirt. And he pulled up this old door, and that is where we stopped with chapter 10. In fact, chapter 10 says, when the dust settled, they could see a rather large hole that had been carefully dug out many years ago. Sitting inside the hole was, and that's where we stopped. So we're going to start now with chapter 11, and here we go. It is entitled The Treasure. Inside was a large wooden box. Yee-haw, shouted all three treasure hunters at the same time. They stood up and did a happy dance around the stable. All right, boys, Mr. Sifford said. This could be something very exciting, or it could be very disappointing. There may not be anything of value in this chest. Don't get your hopes up. The three of them got on their knees, leaned over the hole, and tried to pick up the chest. It was not too heavy, and with some teamwork, they were able to lift it out of the hole and place it in an area of the stable that had the most sunlight. With great care, they opened the lid of the chest. The first thing Mr. Sifford and the boys saw was a velvet cloth, similar to but much larger than the one in the small box found by the creek. The velvet looked as if it had been used to cover windows or a bed or something large. It was in fairly good shape considering where it had been for who knows how long. The heavy cloth had done a good job of protecting the contents of the chest. They treated each item very carefully. Mr. Sifford told them to treat the items with respect because John Sifford had hidden these items for a reason. Jonas picked a book up out of the chest. He held it over in the sunlight so he could see it better. It was not written in English. Mr. Sifford said it was in German. Jonas laid it down carefully on the velvet cloth that had been spread out on the lid of the chest. You want to see what it looked like? This was the book that was in the chest. This large book. It was old. It was really old. And when he opened it up, it looked like this. I don't know if you can tell, but it wasn't English. Mr. Sifford said it was in German. So I wonder what kind of book this is. but we'll find out. Let's see what else was in there. Okay. All right. Dale reached into the chest and pulled out a pouch that closed with the drawstring. He pulled the pouch open and emptied the contents in his hand. Out of the pouch fell several gold coins. You want to see what that looks like? Here it is. Where'd it go? Hang on. It's right here. I promise you, it's right here. Yes, here it is. Okay, here was this leather pouch. It had a drawstring on it. You know what a drawstring is? It has a little string, and there are holes at the top of it. And you pull it like this, and it closes it. Okay? You may have something like this that you put marbles or something else in. Okay. So, and they opened it up, and what fell out? You remember? Several gold coins. Several gold coins. I'm having a hard time holding them where you can see them. Several gold coins. Wow. Wow. Now that's not all. There's still some more in here. I think they were probably happy about that discovery. Okay. We found gold, Dale shouted. Look at these gold coins. Those are beautiful, said Jonas with excitement. Although he had hoped to find gold, he knew it was highly unlikely that they would. Wow, was all Mr. Sifford could say. For several long seconds, those are beautiful. Dale put the coins back into the pouch without counting them. He knew there were more inside the pouch, and they could count them when they had more light. Mr. Sifford waited patiently and watched as the boys selected an item to take out of the box. Jonas and Dale had been the ones to find the small wooden box by the creek that began the adventure, and he wanted them to be the ones to take the items out of the chest. Next, Jonas pulled something out, wrapped in another piece of velvet cloth. He uncovered a flag. It was a homemade American flag. The colors had faded some, and there were a few small holes in it. Jonas could tell it was smaller than the flag that was in the triangle case in his home. Mr. Sifford held the flag up for the boys to see, and then he gently folded it back and laid it on the velvet cloth with the other items. Dale selected the next item. It was a large glass jar. Dale put his hand on the metal lid and tried to open it. The jar had a wide mouth on it, and Dale's hand couldn't reach across it. He gave it to Mr. Sifford to open. Inside, they found several old documents and pieces of paper. There were too many to stop and look at individually, but they could tell most of them were receipts from purchases made at a general store for food and supplies. Later, they could look at them more closely. So the jar they found had a wide mouth on it. All right, so they found this old jar. And inside it has, first of all, it's got this wide mouth. Well, Dale's hand was too small to open it up. So he gave it to Mr. Sifford, and Mr. Sifford opened it up. And inside they found all of these old papers that were inside. Of course, they turned yellow. You know, paper turns yellow with age. It just gets brittle, so you have to be careful. Well, some of the items that they found in the box, or in the jar, were things like this. This is an old deed for some land. And if you look at it carefully, it shows the date up here at the top. And inside it tells, it's handwritten, and it tells detail by detail where the land goes to. And sometimes in that day, they would say it goes to the creek, the edge of the creek, or it goes over, you know, to a certain marker that they have. And so this was an old deed. And then they found these old receipts, these really old receipts for different things. This one was a banknote dated August 31st, 1808. And then this one was another one that was for some groceries that they bought, and it was dated May 29th, 1832. So there were all these kind of things that were in that jar. Now, thank goodness they were in that jar because they couldn't get wet and they were protected from the air and the dirt. So that was a smart move on Mr. Sifford's part. All right, so we've got that taken care of. And there was one last item in the chest. Mr. Sifford leaned over and pulled it out. It was another book. Its pages had turned yellow with age and it was very fragile. It appeared to be a diary written by Joachim Sifford, John Sifford's grandfather. Well, boys, it looks like it's it. We've hit the jackpot as far as I'm concerned. Let's load this stuff back in the chest and get it home. Mr. Sifford and the boys gathered all the items and placed them back in the box. With great care, they carried the chest to the tree where they had left the tool bag. Mr. Sifford took out some heavy cord and wrapped it around the chest several times. He did not want to take a chance that the chest would fall apart. When it was secure, Jonas and Dale each took one end of the chest to carry, and Mr. Sifford picked up the tool bag. After a long and careful walk back to Mr. Sifford's car, they loaded the treasure chest and the tools into the trunk. They were all tired and dirty and hungry. They decided to go home, get some rest, and start the next day looking more closely at the items. Chapter 12. The next day began with Mr. Sifford and the boys unloading the trunk of the car. He cleared off a place on the back porch to lay out the items. He gathered together some things he thought would help them. A flashlight, a magnifying glass, a tablet of paper, and a pencil were placed on the small table next to where the items from the chest would be placed. We were lucky yesterday, boys, Mr. Sifford said. If that rain hadn't come up, we'd still be digging by that big rock and the tree. Why would Mr. Sifford bury a treasure in a stable? Jonas asked. He had been trying to figure it out on his own, but he could not imagine why someone would bury a treasure in a horse stable. I don't know the answer to that, Mr. Sifford said. That is one of the mysteries we will try to solve. There is one good thing about it, though. It was protected from the rain and snow and wind. If it hadn't been in a sheltered place, the chest would have been in much worse shape. Mrs. Sifford opened the door leading to the porch. She turned around to pick up a tray loaded with 4 glasses and a plate of muffins. I thought we could all use a snack, she said as she set the tray down. What have you got there, Virginia? Mr. Sifford asked. Cold milk and blueberry muffins, she said. The boys jumped to their feet and served themselves. They were beginning to feel very comfortable with Mr. and Mrs. Sifford. Once their snack was over, Mr. Sifford and the boys got to work. Mr. Sifford suggested they look at each item carefully. Mrs. Sifford's job was to write the description of each item and read it aloud to Mr. Sifford and the boys. The first item they selected was the pouch of gold coins. There were 30 coins in the pouch. Each coin was gold and dated 1839. Let me tell you about these coins, Mr. Sifford said as he reached for the magnifying glass so he could examine them better. These coins were minted at the U.S. Mint in Charlotte, about 30 miles from here. In the early 1830s, gold was discovered in Cabarrus County, North Carolina. At that time, the only mint in the U.S. was in Philadelphia, and in order to turn the gold into coins, the gold found in North Carolina had to be carried by wagon all the way to Philadelphia. The U.S. Congress passed the Mint Act of 1835 that provided for a mint to be built in Charlotte. There were 2 other mints created with the Mint Act. One was Delonga, Georgia, and the other one was in New Orleans, Louisiana. Mr. Sifford continued. continued as the boys sat and listened without interrupting. During the Civil War, the mint was shut down and it was turned into an ammunition plant. It never reopened as a mint. Today, it is a museum, the Mint Museum of Art. If you are ever in Charlotte, you should stop in for a visit. Mr. Sifford handed each one of the boys a coin. Look at that coin carefully, right above the date. Do you see that letter C? That stands for Charlotte. I bet there aren't too many of these coins left. And these are probably extremely valuable. Jonas and Dale looked at their coins and found the letter C. They looked at both sides of the coins and handed them back to Mr. Sifford, who put them into the pouch for safekeeping. Next, Mr. Sifford opened the glass jar. Inside the jar were numerous pieces of paper. Mr. Sifford looked at each one and told Mrs. Sifford what it was so she could write it down. The contents included receipts for items purchased for the farm, the deed for the 247 acres of land purchased from Green, his first name was Greenberry Low, and it was dated 1808, and handwritten information about the farm. The deed was proof the land belonged to John Sifford, and the receipts showed how much John paid for animals and tools, supplies, and groceries. This was great historical information for the period of time that John Sifford lived in Lincoln County. And as Mr. Sifford placed the jar to the side, Dale handed him the book written in German. The book was a Bible. I am amazed at the condition of this Bible, Mr. Sifford said. On the inside cover of the Bible is the name Johann Leonard Sieffert. This is probably the Bible Leonard brought with him to America in 1752. And that's over 200 years ago. I wish this Bible could talk and tell us about where it has been and what it has witnessed. How come Johann Leonard Sieffert spelled his name differently from his son's name as Jonas? Good question, Jonas, Mr. Sifford said. When people came to America from foreign countries, they spelled their names according to their home languages. Once they were in America, they lived by and worked with people from many countries who spoke many languages. When someone asked them what their name was, the person writing it down would spell it the best way they could. Sieffert in German sounded like Sifford by people who spoke English. Eventually, Sifford became more American in its spelling and was adopted by the Sifford family. The Bible represented something important to the Sifford family, explained Mr. Sifford. The freedom of religion was one of the reasons so many people came to America. My German ancestors did not experience the religious oppression that many other settlers did, but their freedom to worship was so important to them that wherever they settled, they built a church as quickly as they could. Mr. Sifford stood up and went to the dining table for a map of North Carolina. He spread it open for the boys to look at. Right here, he continued, is Salisbury. It is in Rowan County, and it is the area where Johann Leonard Sieffert first settled after he moved his family from Pennsylvania. Not far from Salisbury is a small community called Granite Quarry. There is a Lutheran church near Granite Quarry called the Oregon Lutheran Church. Today, there's a nice modern church that the church members worship in. But standing close by is the original church built by the hands and sweat of Johann Leonard Sieffert, his brothers George and William, and other German settlers. The church was completed in 1794. It was made of granite found in the area, and the mortar used between the rocks was made from seashells that had been hauled in wooden wagons all the way from the North Carolina coast. Those shells were ground up into sand and mixed with water to form mortar. It was a grand church at that time in North Carolina. Many years after the church was built, it acquired an organ. It was the only church for many miles around to have an organ, and so people began referring to it as the Organ Church. The name stuck, and that's what it is still called today. Now, somewhere around here, I've got a picture of that old church. I actually visited this church. All right, hopefully you can see this old church. And right up, let me put it a little closer, right up at the very top of the church on one of those sides, I think it's around on the other side, there is a round marker, and they have written in there with a stick, 1794. And you see the headstones that are out in front of it. There's an old cemetery right beside that church. So that's a church built at Granite Quarry, North Carolina in 1794. Pretty cool, huh? All right, Mr. Sifford dusted the Bible. Oh, wait a minute, I've already read that. Hang on. All right. Okay, no. Mr. Sifford dusted the Bible and placed it on the velvet cloth while Jonas handed him the next item, the handmade American flag. This is a 28-star flag, Mr. Sifford said. That means it was made after 1845 when Texas became the 28th state. Look at the stars. There are 4 rows of 7 stars. Every time a new state becomes a part of the United States, a new star is added. Today, in 1958, we have 48 stars on our flag. What if we get more states, Mr. Sifford asked Jonas. Then what would we do? We would alter the arrangement of the stars again, Mr. Sifford explained. Right now, there is some talk about adding Alaska and Hawaii. It is possible that our flag will be gaining 2 more stars. Mr. Sifford looked closely at the stitches on the flag. This flag was handmade, and it may have been made by a group of ladies in the quilting club. Ladies in the community used to get together for quilting parties. It took a lot of time and hands to make a quilt so that the ladies would get together and help each other. It is quite possible that this flag was made to fly in their community, or John Sifford may have flown it in his home. The people who settled in America were proud of their new nation, Mr. Sifford said as he carefully folded the flag. They had seen with their own eyes how people were mistreated or told by the government how to worship or made to pay unfair taxes. People in North Carolina were proud to be Americans. In America, they could feed their families, live in a safe and prosperous community, and worship without fear of persecution. Pride for our nation was felt by everyone. The early Americans wanted to display the flag at home and in front of the public buildings. And when they went to war, the flag was the symbol of freedom that kept them focused on their mission. Mr. Sifford paused and looked into the eyes of the boys who had not taken their eyes off of him. Jonas said, "I have a flag at home. My mother showed it to me about a week ago. She keeps it in a case that looks like a triangle. She told me it was the flag that was on my grandfather's casket after he died in World War II. World War II was a big war. That flag is a symbol of our nation, and I bet from now on you will think about your grandfather every time you see an American flag. Your grandfather fought to protect and defend our nation," Mr. Sifford said. "I hope you boys will love, honor, and respect the American flag. It was under that flag that men and women have died in wars over the years, and so that you and I could enjoy our freedoms today, and that includes your grandfather, Jonas." Jonas sat up straight. He was proud of his grandfather and hoped someday people would be proud of him too. The last item in the box was the diary of John Sifford's grandfather, Joachim Sifford. Page by page, Mr. Sifford read the notations in the diary and summarized it. The old diary was an old leather book. It was bound with this long strip of leather and then tied, and inside were all the notes that Mr. Joachim Sifford had written. Remember, Joachim Sifford was the one who came to America from Germany, and there were all kinds of notes written in here. So now let's find out what was written in this old diary. All right, let's see. Let me find it again. Mr. Sifford told the boys that in the spring of 1753, the Sifford family lived in the area of Finkenbach, Germany. For several years, life had been difficult for many German families in that area. Year after year of severe droughts and crop failures meant that food was scarce. Joachim was worried about his family. Joachim had already allowed one of his sons, Johann Leonard, to go to America with Hans and Anna Edelman. Hans Edelman was from Gamlensbach and was a relative of Joachim's wife, Eva Elizabeth Edelman, or as her family called her, Lizzie. Hans had heard about a new land called America and decided to move his family across the Atlantic Ocean to start a new family. Leonard pleaded with his father to allow him to go to America with Hans and Anna, and because things were so bad in Germany, Joachim made the decision to let him go. That was in 1752, when Leonard was only 9 years old. Leonard and the Edelmans boarded a ship called Snow Kitty for their trip to America. He brought with him a small wooden box for his valuables and a German Bible. After Hans and Anna Edelman became established in Philadelphia, Hans wrote a letter to Lizzie and Joachim. He told them about the fertile lands, the forests full of wildlife, and streams teeming with fish. He said that it was all available to the settlers, and there was plenty of land on which to farm. To a starving man in Germany, the news was inspiring. With mixed emotions, Sifford sold his possessions, said goodbye to many of his family and friends, and boarded a ship on the Rhine River that would eventually take the family to a port in Rotterdam, Netherlands. There they boarded the ship named Two Brothers for a very long voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. In September of 1753, Joachim Sifford, along with the remainder of his family, arrived in Philadelphia. They were glad that the long journey was finally over. It had been a difficult trip across the Atlantic, and many people on the ship were sick. Joachim looked forward to being on solid land that would not move with the wind and waves. Their hearts were pounding as they stepped off the ship. They were excited and scared all at the same time. There were many people at the pier to greet the new arrivals. When ships were seen at a distance, the news spread quickly throughout the town that a ship was coming in, and people would rush to the harbor to see if they could spot any of their family or friends getting off the ship. Now the Siffords would need to find their son Leonard and the Edelman family somewhere in the big city of Philadelphia. It could have been a difficult task, but as they made their way off the ship, Joachim could hear someone calling his name in a familiar German accent. Joachim, Lizzie, over here, over here. And there in the middle of the crowd was Hans Edelman, jumping up and down to get their attention. Joachim thanked God for their safe journey and wrapped his arms around Hans. One journey was over and the next one was just beginning. Joachim prayed that their new journey would be a good one for his family. Leonard Sifford was 10 years old when his father, mother, and the remainder of his family arrived in Philadelphia. Leonard was happy with his new life in America and was eager to show them around. He found America to be a land full of opportunities, and he was doing everything he could to learn English. He was excited about his future, and he wanted to make a difference in America. He dreamed of owning his own land someday and becoming a productive and respected citizen. In the diary, Joachim wrote about his sons. Over the years, the boys grew and matured until one day Joachim realized his sons were now men. Joachim wrote that Leonard and his brothers had become restless. Allentown and Philadelphia were now booming cities, and his sons wanted to be farmers like their father. News spread around the Philadelphia area that North Carolina was a wonderful place with plenty of rich farmland that could be bought at a fair price. In 1768, Leonard and his brothers, George and William, left Allentown on horses and traveled south on the Great Pennsylvania Wagon Road toward North Carolina. Joachim said in his diary that he had tears in his eyes as he thought about his sons leaving his homestead in Pennsylvania. Joachim was getting to be an old man. He knew he would probably never see his sons again. Mr. Sifford paused for a moment, looked at Jonas and Dale, and then said, "I wonder how Leonard came into possession of this diary. I suppose that it's possible that before his sons left, Joachim gave the diary to Leonard. I'm sure that he wanted his sons to remember him and their journey to America. I can almost see Leonard and his brothers give their father one final hug, mount their horses, and wave goodbye." Mr. Sifford smiled at the boys and said, "I think Joachim would be pleased to know that his grandson John Sifford had taken good care of this diary, and that almost 200 years later, the two of you found it in a buried chest." Mr. Sifford set the diary aside. He treasured the thoughts Joachim had written in his diary. It was not easy for a man to express his emotions, and yet Joachim had done it very well. He realized that moving across the ocean had been a bittersweet event. The only item left in the chest that they had not talked about was the velvet cloth. Mr. Sifford had no idea of the significance of it other than it was a beautiful cloth that protected John Sifford's valuables. "And now, boys," Mr. Sifford said, "we have discovered the hidden treasure of John Sifford." Mr. Sifford had no idea of the significance of any of the things that he had buried. Some of the mysteries had been solved, and hopefully this was one of them, with the buried treasure. The boys decided to head home for the day. They had some good stories to tell their parents. Mr. Sifford wanted the boys to wait about telling anyone other than their parents about the treasure. He had some work to do first. "Dale, this has been so much fun," Jonas said as they walked toward home. "What are we going to do now? I cannot imagine going to see Mr. Sifford every morning." "We've got to keep seeing him, Jonas," Dale said. "He has our treasure." "You're right," said Jonas. "We should go see him every day, and Mrs. Sifford too." The boys had certainly grown fond of their new friends. Wasn't that a great chapter? We found out all about the items in the treasure chest. Our next chapter, as the story continues, is called The 4th of July Parade. Have you ever been to a 4th of July parade? Have you ever wanted to be in a parade? Well, we're going to do chapter 13 in just a moment. So I'm going to take a break, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to read another chapter. Thank you for being here with me, and I will be right back with you.